Avoidants don't attach to people, they attach to control. Avoidants experience emotional safety not through closeness, but through predictability. Their nervous system is wired to stay regulated by managing variables, how close things get, how fast intimacy moves, and when distance is reintroduced. Control becomes their substitute for security. When they can anticipate reactions, set the pace, and emotionally stay one step ahead, their system stays calm. This is why they often appear composed, rational, or detached during moments that would overwhelm others. It isn't that they don't feel, it's that they've learned to survive by staying in command of emotional exposure. Control gives them the illusion of stability, even when connection underneath is fragile. In relationships, this shows up subtly. They choose when conversations happen, how deep they go, and when things need space. They often frame it as independence or maturity, but at its core, it's regulation through distance. When a partner follows their rhythm, leans in when allowed, backs off when signaled, the avoidant feels safe enough to remain present. But when someone doesn't conform to that rhythm, something shifts internally. The nervous system loses its familiar anchor. The calm they rely on starts to fracture, not because intimacy increased, but because predictability disappeared. This is why the person they couldn't control becomes so destabilizing. Not controlling someone doesn't just mean losing influence, it means losing regulation. When you didn't react the way they expected, didn't chase after distance, didn't escalate emotionally when they pulled away, their internal system had nothing to stabilize against. Your unpredictability wasn't chaotic, it was autonomous. And autonomy is threatening to an avoidant because it can't be managed, timed, or contained. They don't experience this as missing you in the traditional sense. It feels more like mental noise, a loop, an unresolved tension. Their mind keeps returning to the moment where control slipped, not to romanticize it, but to try to understand it, to regain mastery over something that didn't bend. That's why they replay conversations, analyze your reactions, and fixate on what changed. The obsession isn't about connection, it's about restoring internal order. What's important to understand is that this isn't conscious manipulation. Most avoidants aren't thinking, how do I control this person? They're thinking, how do I stay calm? Control is simply the fastest route their nervous system knows. So when they meet someone who remains grounded without needing reassurance, who doesn't emotionally chase or collapse, it disrupts the strategy that's kept them safe for years. You didn't become unforgettable because you demanded more. You became unforgettable because you required nothing. That could be managed. Your emotional self-containment removed the familiar push-pull dynamic they relied on. And in that absence of control, their system stayed alert, not peaceful. That's the paradox. The less you tried to secure them, the more they mentally returned to you. Not because they were ready for intimacy, but because for the first time, control didn't work. The person who didn't beg is the one they can't forget. Avoidants are deeply familiar with a certain relational rhythm, distance followed by pursuit. Over time, many of their connections train partners to overfunction emotionally, explaining intentions, softening boundaries, offering reassurance, wading through silence, and carrying the weight of repair. This dynamic allows the avoidant to stay regulated without fully engaging. They pull back, the other leans in, and the emotional balance is restored in their favor. It's not always intentional, but it is familiar. Familiarity feels safe to a nervous system that equates closeness with threat. Chasing gives avoidance something critical, emotional leverage. When someone pursues, the avoidant doesn't have to wonder where they stand. The connection feels contained, predictable, and low risk. Even discomfort is tolerable when it comes with proof of importance. The partner's pursuit reassures them without demanding reciprocal vulnerability. This is why avoidants often relax when someone explains, waits, or tries harder after distance. The system settles because the hierarchy remains intact. But when someone doesn't chase, the entire structure collapses. No follow-up texts, no emotional explanations, no attempts to pull them back into connection. The avoidant expects a response that never comes, and the silence doesn't feel like peace. It feels like disorientation. Without pursuit, there's no feedback loop to confirm significance, no reassurance without intimacy, no proof of control. This is where fixation begins. Not because the avoidant suddenly feels emotionally available, but because the pattern broke. The mind doesn't know how to categorize a bond that ended without pleading or pursuit. The absence of chasing removes emotional closure. There's no win, no confirmation that distance worked. Instead, there's a quiet question that lingers. Why didn't they try? That question is far more destabilizing than anger or grief. Anger would keep the avoidant in control. Grief would still center them emotionally, but non-pursuit does neither. It creates a vacuum, and the nervous system, uncomfortable with unresolved dynamics, fills that vacuum with rumination. They replay moments, reassess interactions, and search for signs they may have misjudged the connection. What they fixate on isn't your absence, it's your self-regulation. You didn't collapse when they withdrew. You didn't escalate. You didn't bargain for closeness. Your steadiness challenged their internal map of relationships. It suggested that connection could exist without emotional dependence, and that's deeply unsettling for someone who equates control with safety. This fixation doesn't mean they're ready to return or repair. Avoidance can obsess privately while maintaining distance publicly. Obsession happens in the mind. Intimacy requires embodiment and risk, but the one who didn't chase remains lodged in their awareness because you didn't play the role that makes distance feel safe. You didn't give them leverage, and without leverage, the system never fully settles. In the end, it wasn't your intensity that made you unforgettable. It was your restraint. You didn't demand to be chosen, and that's exactly why you couldn't be dismissed. What they obsess over isn't you, it's the moment they lost control. Avoidant obsession is often misunderstood as suppressed longing, but it operates on a different axis entirely. Longing is emotional and relational. Obsession for an avoidant is cognitive and regulatory. It emerges when the internal system can't reconcile an outcome that didn't follow the expected script. Avoidants are most at ease when they can predict how a connection unfolds, how it begins, how it cools, and how it ends. When they get to dictate that arc, they can emotionally minimize the bond and move on with a sense of closure. But when the ending escapes their control, the mind doesn't release it. It keeps circling, not out of desire, but out of unfinished business. Avoidants tend to replay situations where they didn't get to decide the emotional conclusion, moments where someone disengaged calmly, didn't argue for resolution, or exited without emotional collapse, disrupt the usual power dynamic. There's no dramatic rupture to justify distance, no emotional intensity to dismiss the bond as too much. Instead, there's ambiguity, and ambiguity is deeply uncomfortable for someone who relies on emotional categorization to feel safe. Their mind loops on what couldn't be neatly closed. They revisit conversations, search for miscues, and mentally rewrite outcomes, not to rekindle intimacy, but to restore internal order. Obsession becomes a way to regain a sense of control after the fact. If they can understand it, label it, or reduce it to a manageable explanation, the nervous system can finally stand down. Until then, the unresolved dynamic stays active. What they're fixated on isn't your presence, it's your independence within the connection. You didn't escalate emotionally when they pulled away. You didn't fight for reassurance or demand clarity. That lack of reaction removed the familiar hierarchy, where their distance held power. Without that hierarchy, the emotional story stayed unfinished. They couldn't frame themselves as the calm one, leaving chaos behind. And without that narrative, the mind had nowhere to file the experience. This is why obsession can coexist with emotional unavailability. Avoidance can think about someone frequently without feeling compelled to reconnect. The rumination serves a different purpose. It's an attempt to regain mastery over a situation that didn't resolve on their terms. Intimacy would require vulnerability and risk. Obsession requires only mental energy. One threatens the nervous system, the other feels safer. It's also why avoidance may appear unaffected externally while internally replaying the connection. From the outside, it looks like detachment. Internally, the mind is working overtime to close a loop that never closed. They may tell themselves it wasn't that deep, yet keep returning to it precisely because it wasn't emotionally diminished at the end. Understanding this distinction is important. Being obsessed over doesn't mean you were deeply loved, and it doesn't guarantee repair. What it means is that you stepped outside their usual relational script. You didn't provide the emotional response that would have allowed them to feel powerful, justified, or in control. And that absence, quiet, grounded, unresolved, is what keeps the memory alive. In the end, their obsession isn't a signal for you to return. It's evidence that the power dynamic shifted. You didn't stay long enough to be minimized. And because of that, the ending never fully belong to them. You didn't need them, and that's what made you unforgettable. Avoidance feels safest in relationships where they are wanted but not required. Being needed in practical or surface level ways affirms their value without demanding emotional exposure. Emotional reliance, however, triggers pressure. It signals responsibility for another person's internal world, something avoidants learned early to avoid, so they unconsciously seek a narrow middle ground, valued enough to feel important, distant enough to feel free. Within that space, their nervous system stays regulated and the relationship feels manageable. Their role in these dynamics is often subtle but consistent. They become the emotional thermostat, deciding when closeness is allowed, when distance is necessary, and how much feeling is acceptable at any given moment. When a partner looks to them for cues, reassurance, or regulation, it reinforces that role. They stay calm because they're not fully in it, they're managing it. That sense of emotional authority is stabilizing. It allows them to participate without vulnerability. Your emotional self-containment disrupted that structure. You didn't collapse into anxiety when they pulled back. You didn't lean on them to soothe uncertainty. You didn't hand them the responsibility of regulating your emotional state. Instead, you remained grounded within yourself. You experienced feelings without outsourcing them. And that independence quietly removed their role as the regulator of the connection. This is where the imbalance began to haunt them. Without emotional reliance, they couldn't locate their position in the dynamic. They weren't needed to stabilize you, reassure you, or set the emotional pace. Your steadiness made their distance feel unnecessary rather than powerful. And for an avoidant, unnecessary distance is destabilizing because it doesn't produce the expected result, control. They're used to partners reacting, needing clarity, seeking reassurance. Your lack of emotional dependency created an unfamiliar equation. Connection without leverage. They couldn't pace intimacy by withdrawing because your system didn't spike. There was no emotional consequence to manage, no visible proof of their impact. That absence left them unsettled, not relieved. This doesn't mean they felt drawn closer. Often, it produces the opposite externally. Avoidance may increase distance when their usual strategies fail, but internally, the mind stays alert. Your emotional self-sufficiency doesn't register as rejection. It registers as unpredictability. And unpredictability is threatening to a system that relies on control to feel safe. What stayed with them wasn't your affection, it was your autonomy. You didn't position them as the emotional center of your world. You didn't need them to feel okay. And that forced them to confront something uncomfortable. They weren't in charge of how the connection affected you. The power dynamic they depended on never fully formed. This is why your presence lingered long after contact ended. Not because they were ready to love differently, but because their strategy failed quietly. There was no dramatic rupture to justify detachment, no emotional dependence to point to, just a person who stayed regulated, connected, and intact without needing them to hold it all together. In the end, it wasn't your intensity that marked them, it was your containment. You didn't ask them to be your anchor, and in not needing them, you removed the role that made distance feel safe. Your silence didn't free them, it exposed them. Avoidants are conditioned to believe that distance equals relief. When emotional intensity rises, pulling back has historically calmed their nervous system. Space reduces stimulation, lowers expectations, and restores a sense of autonomy. In past relationships, distance usually worked because it triggered pursuit. The other person would reach out, seek reassurance, or try to repair the bond. That reaction served as confirmation: I matter, I'm still central, I can disengage without losing relevance. Distance didn't cost them leverage, it reinforced it. So when they withdrew from you, they expected the same outcome: a check-in, a question, an explanation, something that proved the bond still revolved around their movements. But your silence didn't behave the way silence usually does. It didn't chase them down. It didn't ask to be resolved. It simply existed, calm, contained, and unreactive. And that's where the system began to feel uneasy. Distance, without pursuit, doesn't feel like freedom to an avoidant. It feels like uncertainty. Without a reaction, there's no emotional data to regulate against, no confirmation of importance, no reassurance without vulnerability. The nervous system, used to calming itself through control, stays activated instead. Silence becomes loud, because it refuses to explain itself. What was exposed in that silence wasn't indifference, it was the absence of leverage. When distance no longer provokes pursuit, it loses its function. The avoidant can't tell whether they're missed, dismissed, or simply not needed. And not being needed is far more destabilizing than being wanted too much. Desire can be managed, autonomy cannot. This is why your lack of response carried more weight than confrontation ever could. Conflict would have kept you emotionally engaged. Anger would have positioned them as significant. Even sadness would have centered their impact. But your silence did none of that. It removed them from the role of emotional gravity. They weren't the cause of your distress, and they weren't the solution either. Internally, this creates a quiet anxiety. Not panic, not longing, alertness. The mind starts scanning for meaning. Did I misread the bond? Did distance finally push them away? Did I lose something without realizing it? These questions don't arise because they want to reconnect. They arise because the strategy failed. Distance didn't restore control, it neutralized it. From the outside, avoidants may appear unaffected during this phase. They might stay silent, delay contact, or rationalize the separation. But internally, the lack of emotional feedback lingers. Silence that doesn't chase doesn't allow for emotional minimization. There's no proof the connection was insignificant. And without that proof, the mind can't fully let go. It's important to understand your silence wasn't a tactic. It was a boundary. You didn't withhold to provoke. You simply stopped over-functioning. And that's why it had impact. You removed yourself from the familiar cycle where distance creates pursuit and pursuit restores power. In the end, distance didn't calm them because it didn't work the way it always had. It didn't give them peace. It took away the one thing that made distance feel safe: leverage. They don't crave connection. They crave emotional dominance. What avoidants often interpret as missing someone is rarely about shared intimacy or emotional closeness. It's about the loss of a familiar internal position. In many of their relationships, emotional distance places them on higher ground. They feel calmer, less exposed, more composed than their partner. That imbalance isn't accidental, it's regulatory. Being the less emotionally invested one gives them a sense of safety and authority over the connection. It allows them to stay present without feeling engulfed. Over time, this position becomes part of their identity. They see themselves as rational, steady, and unaffected, while others are emotional, attached, or reactive. This isn't necessarily arrogance, it's survival. Emotional superiority feels like regulation. If they're less impacted, they're less vulnerable. If they're in control of the emotional temperature, they don't have to risk dependence. When you were in the picture, that hierarchy quietly existed until it didn't. The moment you stopped reacting in expected ways, the structure began to collapse. You didn't spiral when they pulled back. You didn't try to win them over emotionally. You didn't remain frozen in their absence. You felt processed and moved forward without needing their participation. And that's where the real disruption occurred. They didn't lose you as much as they lost the version of themselves that felt powerful in the dynamic. When they couldn't control how deeply you felt, and later couldn't control how completely you healed, the internal hierarchy they relied on dissolved. They were no longer the calm one, standing over emotional chaos. You were regulated without them, and that repositions everything.
This is deeply unsettling for an avoidant. Emotional dominance provides a buffer against vulnerability. It reassures them that they're safe because they're not as invested. When that dominance disappears, they're left with a quieter, more uncomfortable truth. Connection didn't require them to be above it. They weren't the emotional anchor they believed themselves to be.
What they miss then isn't the relationship itself. It's the sense of control that came with it. The ease of knowing they mattered without having to show up fully. The comfort of being central to someone else's emotional world without sharing their own. When that disappears, the system registers loss, not of love, but of position. This is why avoidants can feel unsettled, even when they're the ones who created distance. They may tell themselves they're fine, that the connection ran its course. Yet, internally, there's friction. The self-image of being the composed, unaffected one no longer holds when the other person moves on with dignity and stability. It's also why healing without resentment is so impactful. Anger would have kept them emotionally elevated. Hurt would have preserved the imbalance. But your healing equalized the field. You didn't stay beneath their detachment. You stood level, and then walked away. Understanding this prevents misinterpretation. Their rumination doesn't mean they want to return or repair. It means they're adjusting to a new internal reality where emotional control didn't guarantee importance. You didn't take something from them. You simply stopped participating in a dynamic that made them feel superior. In the end, they don't miss you the way secure attachment misses connection. They miss the version of themselves that felt protected by distance, and that version no longer exists. Nothing unsettles an avoidant like someone who moved on without resentment. Avoidants are psychologically prepared for certain emotional responses after distance: anger, sadness, protest, even bitterness. These reactions are familiar and manageable. Each one assigns them a role. Anger makes them the one who caused pain. Grief keeps them central as the one who is missed. Even resentment confirms impact. All of these emotions orbit around them, allowing the avoidant to stay emotionally significant without having to re-engage. Your healing removed that orbit. When you didn't vilify them, didn't lash out, and didn't frame yourself as abandoned or wronged, their nervous system lost its reference point. There was no emotional charge to regulate against, no narrative that positioned them as the center of your emotional world. You didn't make them the villain, but you didn't make them the hero either. You simply stepped out of the story. Peace is profoundly destabilizing for an avoidant when it arrives without reconciliation. They expect healing to require explanation, closure, or repair. When someone heals quietly, it suggests something they struggle to accept. That connection didn't define your stability. And if it didn't define your stability, then their distance didn't hold the power they believed it did. This is where memory hardens instead of fading. Anger would have allowed emotional dismissal. Grief would have eventually exhausted itself, but peace offers no such resolution. The avoidant can't reduce the bond too much, too needy, or too emotional. There's no evidence to support emotional minimization. So the mind keeps returning, trying to locate significance. Your lack of resentment also denies them justification. Avoidants often rely on post-distance narratives to regulate guilt and discomfort. It wasn't right anyway. They were too invested. I did what I had to do. When you heal without bitterness, those narratives weaken. They can't frame themselves as escaping dysfunction if the other person became healthier, calmer, and more grounded afterward. Internally, this creates cognitive friction. If they're okay, what does that say about my role? That question lingers because it can't be easily answered. The mind fills the gap with replaying moments, reevaluating dynamics, and revisiting emotional snapshots, not out of longing, but out of unfinished meaning making. This is why your healing locked you into their memory more than any emotional plea ever could. You didn't remain emotionally available for reinterpretation. You didn't linger as an open wound or a source of validation. You became a closed sector that didn't leave emotional debris behind. And closed chapters without chaos are hard for avoidance to categorize. From the outside, it may look like indifference. Internally, it's destabilization. Not enough to pull them toward repair, but enough to keep the memory active. Healing without resentment removes both relevance and responsibility. They're no longer needed to fix you, soothe you, or explain themselves, and that absence is louder than blame. It's important to understand this without romanticizing it. Being remembered doesn't mean being chosen. Avoidance can carry someone in memory while remaining emotionally unavailable. But your peace ensured one thing: you were never minimized. You didn't stay frozen in their shadow. You moved forward intact. In the end, it wasn't your pain that made you unforgettable. It was your freedom. Being unforgettable doesn't mean being chosen. Avoidance replay connections for reasons that often get misread as emotional readiness. When someone occupies their thoughts long after contact ends, it's tempting to believe that love is quietly forming beneath the surface. But for an avoidant, mental replay is not the same as emotional availability. They can think deeply without feeling differently. Obsession lives in the mind. Intimacy lives in the body. And those two rarely align unless real internal work has taken place. What keeps you in their mental loop isn't longing, it's disruption. You didn't follow the familiar relational script. You didn't escalate when they withdrew. You didn't collapse into pursuit or demand resolution. You didn't stay emotionally open-ended for reinterpretation. The pattern they rely on to regulate connection failed quietly. And when a pattern breaks without chaos, the nervous system stays alert, not soothed. Avoidants are experts at compartmentalization. They can replay conversations, analyze moments, and revisit emotional snapshots while remaining physically and emotionally distant. Rumination allows them to engage without repair. On the other hand, would require vulnerability, accountability, and presence, things their system still associates with threat. So the mind keeps circling while the behavior stays unchanged. This is why obsession should never be confused with readiness. An avoidant can be deeply preoccupied with someone they have no intention of returning to. The replay serves a self-regulatory function. It's an attempt to integrate an owners that didn't resolve on their terms. If they can understand it fully, they can contain it. That understanding doesn't require reconnection, only distance and time. What they're replaying isn't the relationship itself, but the moment the dynamic shifted, the point where their usual strategies, distance, silence, emotional neutrality, didn't produce the expected result. Your grounded response didn't pull them closer, but it also didn't collapse. That unresolved middle space is where the mind lingers. Intimacy, however, is not a mental exercise. It requires embodied presence, showing up consistently, tolerating emotional exposure, and staying when discomfort arises. Avoidants who haven't done the internal work may want the familiarity of you in memory, but not the responsibility of you in real life. The echo feels safer than the encounter. This distinction matters because it protects you from misinterpreting signals that never turn into action. Being unforgettable doesn't grant access to someone's capacity for love. It simply means you changed the internal narrative in a way that couldn't be dismissed. That's impact. But impact is not commitment. Avoidants often carry people with them silently, privately, and indefinitely. They may replay you during moments of stress or quiet, but unless they actively dismantle the defenses that kept them distant, those thoughts remain internal. They don't translate into contact, repair, or change. Understanding this is grounding, not discouraging. It returns agency to you. Their obsession doesn't require your availability. Their replay doesn't obligate your return. You didn't break the pattern so they could finally choose you. You broke it so you could step out of it. In the end, being unforgettable is not the prize. Being chosen consistently is, and unless an avoidant does the work to move from mental engagement to embodied connection, their replay stays what it is, a private echo, not a bridge back to you. You didn't win by holding on, you won by letting go. In relationships with avoidance, there's a common misconception that the person who is pursued holds the power. After all, being wanted feels validating. Being chosen seems like the ultimate leverage. But with avoidance, this logic flips. The true power doesn't live in their attention. It lives in what cannot be managed, influenced, or predicted. When someone remains untouchable by the usual push-pull of pursuit, the dynamic shifts entirely. The avoidant is no longer the one directing the emotional flow. They're responding to a presence that exists outside their control. This is why letting go becomes a transformative act. When you stopped explaining yourself, stopped chasing clarity, and stopped seeking reassurance, you quietly redefined their roles. You removed the familiar rhythm that gave them comfort and authority, your emotional availability as a lever. That absence of leverage unsettled them, not because they loved more, but because their system could no longer regulate against your energy. The power dynamic that once existed was dismantled in the simplest of ways. You didn't participate in it. Avoidants are skilled at minimizing, distancing, and rationalizing. They often keep relationships at a safe emotional perimeter where they can influence without overexposing themselves. But when someone refuses to be influenced, refuses to orbit their withdrawal, and refuses to hand over emotional control, the avoidant's usual strategy falters. They can't manipulate, provoke, or secure validation in the ways they are accustomed to. That quiet disruption triggers something deeper than desire. It triggers awareness that the previous dynamic no longer exists. Importantly, this shift is subtle. There are no dramatic confrontations, no grand gestures. Avoidants rarely respond immediately to this change because their system needs time to process the unfamiliar. The power doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It settles quietly in the way they notice your stability without them, your consistency without seeking, and your absence without despair. It's permanent not because they admit it, but because the system they relied on to maintain hierarchy can no longer function. The irony is that the less you engaged in typical relational scripts, chasing, clarifying, explaining, the more memorable you became. Avoidants are most unsettled by autonomy that doesn't bend to their patterns. Being uncontrollable doesn't mean being difficult. It means remaining whole, grounded, and unshakable, regardless of their distance. That is the power they cannot claim. Understanding this shifts perspective. The goal is not to make them notice or to win affection. It is to reclaim your own emotional sovereignty. When you let go of the need to be understood, validated, or chosen, you reclaim a kind of influence that avoidance cannot contain. That is why letting go is never a loss. It is the point where control quietly, irreversibly leaves their hands and returns to yours. In the end, you didn't win by chasing attention. You won by remaining untouchable to control. You became unforgettable, not because they wanted you more, but because they could never contain you. And that is a quiet, tauntful form of power.